Hello, welcome everyone. I am Sciortino. I am the founder and director of SEA-Junction, and SEA-Junction, as you know, is this venue that focus on Southeast Asia, all kind of aspects of Southeast Asia, many of the beauty of this region as well as the many challenges. And today we are going to talk about a very important issue globally and regionally, which is about migration. And interestingly, we are also going to discuss more about the rule of safe migration and whether safe migration is the same as documented migration, which is a claim that is often made. So I look forward to listen to Maryann Bylander, and she will present about her book, The Trade-Off of Legal Status, which indeed focus on all this discussion of whether documented migrants are doing better or not than undocumented migrants, and in which ways, and many other issues that she will explore. So we have the fortune to have her in person, since she's traveling in this region. And we have also the fortune to have again here Ben Harkins, who is a regular and a funding partner of SEA-Junction 2, and he also works for ILO. And so he will be the commentator to Maryann, and then we will open the discussion so you can all contribute to that. So please, Maryann.
The clicker, do I have a clicker? Okay, thank you. So thank you all for being here, and thank you to Leah and all of the Southeast Asia Junction team for organizing. It's just so wonderful to be able to talk about these ideas today. And thank you to Ben in advance, not only for the comments tonight and for moderating, but also for helping me understand the Thai context. One of the challenges with this book is that I actually study Cambodian migration to Thailand, but really from the Cambodian side. Historically, my work has all been in Cambodia. And early on in my fieldwork, I met Ben, and he helped me fill in many of the gaps. I'm sure there's still many on the Thai side, so I really appreciate that support. I also want to acknowledge Res Pasi, who's in the room, who was my research assistant for this book and is also a PhD student here. She's staying in Chiang Mai right now, but studying in France, and is doing some wonderful research on Cambodia. So if you have time after the talk, please get to know her as well. So I'm going to say just a few words about the book tonight. I don't want to speak too long because I want to have some time for conversation to talk about what you're interested in. But because I'm assuming many of you haven't read the book yet, I'll give you a kind of some brief history, how I came to the ideas in the book. I'll share a little bit about the key claims the book makes and kind of walk you through some of the types of things that it explores. And then we can have a broader conversation. So I'm a sociologist by training, and I've spent a considerable amount of time in Cambodia trying to understand, let's see which way this goes. Other way. Okay, got it. Trying to understand migration motivations out of rural areas, particularly rural Siem Reap. So what compels moves to Thailand? What are the experiences that Cambodians have when they cross the border? And what are we missing when we talk about migration? So I've done quite a lot of ethnographic work in rural Cambodia, trying to understand what compels those migrations. And my early PhD work was all about migration decision-making and migration motivations. And the stories that I heard in 2009 when I was first doing my fieldwork were stories you might expect, that Cambodians were migrating for opportunities. They were migrating for jobs, to support their family, because they didn't have great livelihoods at home. Sometimes they would talk about other factors as well, as aspirations for a more modern life, those types of things. And those were all expected. But what was unexpected at the time, and this again was 2009. If you know much about Cambodia, you'll know that that is a time when microfinance, the loans that were given to households, often women, to support livelihood projects in order to help them lift themselves out of poverty. That's the story anyways. These were expanding rapidly. And in fact, by 2010, by most accounts, Cambodia was one of the most microfinance saturated countries in the world, if not the most microfinance saturated country in the world. And that's still true today. And so even by 2009 and 2010, I was starting to hear stories about distress migration related to debt, and also the ways that microfinance loans were entangled in migration in other kind of unexpected ways. And so this became a key focus of my research. And I spent many years trying to kind of understand the links between migration and the expansion of microfinance in Cambodia. And at first, there were some stories of distress migration, but there were also stories of kind of a more positive story where microfinance institutions would lend to households that had a migrant worker, and they could kind of like save up, right? Or save down instead of save up. So instead of saving with those remittances over time, they could take out a loan and repay that loan with the remittances that a family member was having. But then, of course, that became more complicated if there were disruptions to migration in any kind of way. And so the more that I learned about migration and microfinance, the more I started to hear distress stories more commonly than those stories of something that was a little bit more enabling. And so I came to the view that the microfinance sector in Cambodia, as it grew, became much more predatory. And this isn't perhaps surprising because it also became much more commercial. And so in 2017, I applied for a grant, the ASEAN Fulbright Research Grant, to explore not just what was happening between microfinance and migration on the Cambodian side, but also to see what I could learn about what was happening on the Thai side. And I was awarded that grant, and I was really excited. And then in 2017, the Royal Ordinance on Migration was announced. And I was curious what was going to happen with my research. At first, I thought, well, maybe this won't change anything. And I started doing my field work, and I was, Pasi and I did field work in Cambodia. We did some work on the Thai border at a Poi Pet center where Cambodians are deported or officially returned to Cambodia by Thai immigration authorities. And we did some other types of work. And very quickly, we came to learn that Royal Ordinance was having a tremendous impact, that people were seeking out passports, that nearly everyone was in the process of making documents, as they would say, or trying to obtain documents. And it was clear to me, even just early on, that these efforts to obtain documents were really connected to the experiences that, or to the stories of debt, to people's experiences with the debts they already had. And also, of course, the need for documents created new debts because documents were quite costly, even more costly than they were supposed to be on paper. And I also just then started paying attention to regularization and to these efforts that Cambodians were going through to get documents, because it was what people were complaining about. And as a good ethnographic researcher, I was interested in the things that were frustrating to people, right? And the things that they identified as important. And while debt was important, documentation was even more so, and really entangled with those debts. And so, of course, Cambodians I spoke with were frustrated at the costs of these new documents that they had to make, and the way that it complicated the debts they already had, and of course, the new debts that they created. But they were also frustrated because of the restrictions that national verification imposed as they went through it. So under kind of with just a pink card with these more quasi-legal forms of status, it was possible, not always necessarily easy, but possible for Cambodians to change jobs, to have their kids remain with them, to go back and forth across the border relatively easily, relatively low cost if their family had an emergency, or if someone got married or died, or they just wanted to return. And national verification complicated all of those things. So in my fieldwork, I quite early on met a couple whose experiences really kind of exemplified some of these challenges. And it's the intro story of the book follows this couple and speaks with this couple with the decision that they make ultimately to return to Cambodia. Oh, I'm not doing my slides. This is not them, by the way. None of the photos are representative of people I describe in the book. These were actually taken much earlier. But the couple that I begin the book with, Buna and Sopiat, they had been working in Thailand for about 8 years, and they changed jobs frequently, and they obviously had some complications, like most Cambodians do in Thailand, especially without documentation. So they were cheated out of money, their employers exploited them, they were held at gunpoint once, Buna at one point fell and was hospitalized, just risk after risk. And yet none of these things made them say, okay, it's time to go home, this is enough. But the need to get legal documents, the need to go through national verification, the need to get a passport and a work permit and a visa, and the costs that demanded were actually too much. And so when their employer said, you need to either make documents, you need to go through national verification or leave, they said, okay, we're going to leave. And this was quite surprising to me as a researcher, because in the global north, where I come from in the United States, the site of progressive struggle is regularization, right? Migration practitioners and those who advocate for migrant rights really see legal status as the ultimate benefit, right? The thing that will keep people safe and make their lives better and easier. And so to see a Cambodian who didn't have, this kind of sense of security through documents say, actually, no, I don't want that. It's too risky. It's too costly. And no, I'm going to go back to Thailand, where I have no prospects, by the way, was just quite surprising. And this wasn't a common story, I should say. What Bunan Sopet did was relatively rare. But when I was doing my fieldwork, I did encounter people who made similar types of choices, people who had work in Bangkok and then said, okay, I'm not sure if I want to go through national verification. I'm going to go back to a border province and work under a border pass, which is lower cost and isn't going to restrict me in those same ways. And again, this is surprising. More commonly, I just heard Cambodians complain about these processes and talk about them in what I found, again, to be surprising ways. So people in the process of making legal documents say, this isn't freedom like we had before. And again, as someone who studies migration, there's just something quite striking about that type of statement, because we associate legal status with freedom, with entitlement. And the Cambodians that I was learning from and speaking with really did not see this particular form of legal status as bringing those types of benefits. There's a final intervention the book makes. So it explores this idea of the trade-offs of legal status through the experiences of Cambodians. It explores the connections between debt and migration, in particular by thinking about the debts that documents create. But it also explores the development sector, and in particular, the development discourses that justify legal status as beneficial. So as part of my fieldwork, I spent time in places where the Cambodian state and international organizations like the IOM and the ILO and NGOs are kind of enacting their projects. And quite consistently, I found that they reproduce this idea that safe migration is legal migration, and that legal migration is safe migration. And this probably isn't surprising. This is the Migrant Assistance Center in Poi Phet, where some of these migrant education campaigns, safe migration campaigns were enacted. This idea isn't maybe surprising to us if we're familiar with global development discourses, which probably many of you in the room are, where both the Sustainable Development Goals and the Global Compact for Migration kind of make those assumptions quite explicit. They assume that legal migration or regular migration is indeed safer and more beneficial through their language. And so in the book, I ultimately offer a critique of the way that these discourses promote safe migration without questioning the assumption that in all cases, regular or legal migration will produce safety and more beneficial outcomes for migrant workers. So I'll just quickly walk through the chapters. The book begins again at the Migrant Assistance Center on the Poi Phet border. I think it's actually changed location since then, but again, this is where Cambodians were officially returned. And in this chapter, I discuss the rise of safe migration programming and practices in the region, but particularly in Cambodia. And I show how the Cambodian government, but also the actors that are working at places like the Migrant Assistance Center really kind of articulate safe migration and how they conflate safety with legality and regular movement. And then I begin to question those assumptions. So the next chapter moves to a fish processing factory in Rayong, where I engage with what sociologists would call a paired comparison. So this kind of a place I encountered quite accidentally in a way, but it happened to be a place where there were two very different groups of workers one who had come through social networks, mostly clandestinely across the border. Some had pink cards or quasi-legal forms of status. A few were in the process of gaining going through the national verification process, but they'd been undocumented or quasi-documented for some time. And there was also a group that had arrived relatively recently through legal channels, through the Cambodian government's legal system of recruitment and the recruitment agencies that manage that. And well, of course, the discourses that actors promote around safe migration would have us expect that those who came through regular channels had better outcomes, or at least were more positive about their migration experience. This was exactly the opposite of what we found. So those who came through legal channels, regular channels, were saving less, remitting less, earning less, paying more in housing and utility costs. They had higher debts, fewer forms of critical social support, more restrictions on their movement, and ultimately were really frustrated with their experience. In fact, many of them had been asking to leave, some had already left. And in contrast, the group that came through irregular channels had much more positive things to say about their migration experience. So I kind of walk through what that might mean for our understanding of the protections of regular migration. And then the next chapter, because this was a time when everyone is seeking documents or making documents or obtaining documents, just follows some people as they move through that regularization process. So I hung out at the National Verification Centers. Pussy and I spent a lot of time talking to people, and people came up and talked to us. And through these stories, through kind of speaking with them and then meeting with some of them later, I explore just how precarious the documents that were made actually are. In part because policies change frequently, and in part because they're highly restrictive, which means they can be easily invalidated, and in part because the costs are so unknown and so high. And so in this chapter, I also highlight the critical role of the forms of brokerage that are kind of required for national verification and the other processes that Cambodians go through to obtain documents, which of course is part of what creates some of the risks and challenges that migrants face. Excuse me. The next chapter is my favorite chapter because it's all about debt. And so we get the story of microfinance expansion in Cambodia and how that's created new forms of distressed migration, in particular as commercial actors have taken over. And it really highlights how the kind of expansion of microfinance in coordination with these new documentation regimes and needs have really created a double bind for quite a lot of people. So because migrants already hold debts and are already struggling to repay those debts, the unexpected and quite high cost of new debts can make a number of problems. And this chapter also then describes how cross-border microfinance loans sourced in Cambodia but used to fund documentation in Thailand are in practice, do something that's different than the way that other forms of document debts have than the effects of forms of documentation debts that have occurred in other ways, because they link household precarity, or they link migrant precarity in Thailand with household precarity in Cambodia, because these are collateralized loans. And so when migrants then run into trouble in Thailand, it's not just that they can't, they lose the passport, or they have to, lose some income, or they have to change jobs, but there's also quite a risk to the land that they have. The land title is held by the bank, and so they risk losing their land as a consequence of some of the challenges of migration. And I say favorite, not because this is a good thing at all, of course, but because this is, I think really one of the most critical contributions of the book is to really challenge the links, the precarity that is being produced through the links between microfinance institutions and documentation schemes. So the next chapter of the book goes to the ILO and to development actors and all kinds of different examples of safe migration in action. And I hope Ben will forgive me, but I'm quite critical of some of these efforts, not because I don't think they might do some good work, but because they tend to naturalize they tend to still direct migrants towards legal channels as if those legal channels are somehow beneficial and safe. and in doing so, kind of naturalize or elide some of the risks that the legal status and documentation can produce for migrant workers. So I suggest in this chapter that ultimately some of these efforts to advocate for safe migration are really benefiting states, in particular the Thai state, but also the Cambodian state, and their efforts to control migrant workers rather than perhaps benefiting migrants. See, so the final chapter is a conclusion, and I make some I'm not a policymaker, but I do make some policy suggestions suggesting that we really should be focusing on thinking about how we can have a less managed form of migration while still ensuring that people have legal status or the opportunity to have legal status. So I want to be clear about something the book is not saying, but is often something people think I'm saying. I'm not suggesting that legal status isn't important, either for Cambodians in Thailand or for migrants more generally. And similarly, I don't want to offer a romanticized view of irregular migration, which of course has its own risks and indignities and challenges and forms of exploitation. The Cambodians I spoke with typically wanted legal status. They fought for it. They sacrificed for it. One person crossed the border, I don't know, it was 12 or 17 times and, spent hundreds of dollars in search of this elusive form of legal status. However, just as much as they wanted it, they objected to its costs and the immobilities and unfreedoms that it produced. Sometimes they sought to avoid it or delay it or temporarily give it up or prioritize other things. And some obtained status and regretted doing so. And together, these experiences complicate this easy assumption that legal status is inherently protective and highlights the trade-offs that migrants experience by moving through regular channels and by obtaining documents. And these stories also help us attend to the many other things that migrants do see as protective and supportive, some of which they value considerably more than documents. This might include the freedom to change employers easily, the rights to migrate with family, the flexibility to return home on their own schedule, the ability to choose where they work and live, the ability to live and work alongside friends and family who protect them in ways that, of course, I think we could probably all understand. So by drawing attention to the costs and risks and challenges, I'm hoping that we can also imagine some possibilities for forms of state authorized migration that involve fewer of those trade-offs. So that's all I'll say, and I'm happy to talk about whatever you're interested in. So thank you.
So thank you very much. This is very interesting. So now we will hear from the ILO officially and unofficially. We will hear from Ben Harkins, not in his official function, what he thinks about what has just been said.
Okay, thanks, Leah. And I want to start by thanking Maryann and Leah and SEA-Junction for inviting me to be a part of today's launch. I'm really delighted to join this event, share some thoughts on this seminal new book that Maryann has written. It's actually one that I know quite well, as Maryann asked me to help with the peer review several years ago. And in fact, I think I liked it so much at the time, I spent several days reading all 200 pages and providing way more comments than Maryann had expected. So apologies for that. The book covers what is really an extremely timely subject. So as we all know, of course, the specter of irregular migration become an incredibly potent and divisive subject, leveraged by many demagogues around the world to advance their political agendas. What we see now is that elections around the world can turn upon whether politicians are able to present themselves as sufficiently committed to militarizing borders, cracking down on undocumented migrants. The subject of migrant legal status here in Southeast Asia is something I've been researching for about the last 16 years. I do have to humbly acknowledge I've never read a more compelling case for rethinking some of the orthodoxy on this subject. Maryann's book really does a wonderful job of making this extremely complex and sometimes inaccessible policy issue very human-faced by following the lives of several Cambodian migrants in Thailand. What we learned from the experiences of Buna, Sopik, Vet, Tida, there's really no such thing as safe migration for them. Every migration pathway is a bit of a compromise where they have to give up freedoms or scarce financial resources in hopes of, better supporting their families back home. And in particular, I think what the book really lays bare is that regular migration through officially authorized channels doesn't necessarily mean that migrants will be safe and protected by rule of law. I did thoroughly enjoy watching Maryann poke holes in the supposed safety of regular migration, which of course the international community has very unquestioningly promoted. As many of you are probably aware, the routine advice that's provided to migrants is that, yes, they should make use of regular channels because they'll have legal documents, they'll have greater rights and access to services, they'll have reduced vulnerability to exploitation and abuse. However, what the book really exposes is that there are in fact serious limitations and indeed inherent contradictions in what is commonly referred to as safe, orderly, and regular migration. What Maryann shows in practical terms is that the rights that are supposed to be afforded to migrants through going through these regular legal processes, they're actually frequently very underwhelming for migrants. Many of the rights are very highly dependent on the discretion of employers themselves, who usually don't face any serious repercussions if they should not choose to follow the letter of the law. And even if migrants do find a scrupulous employer, what the book shows is that using regular channels for migration to Thailand, it frequently brings with it a whole range of obligations, and as Maryann calls them, unfreedoms that are seldom clearly explained to migrants beforehand. For example, the high fees and related costs for regular migration frequently require taking on substantial debt that can bind migrant workers to their jobs until they're fully paid back. In addition, the visas and work permits that they receive are tied to a single employer, which prevents migrants from leaving their jobs to seek better working conditions or to report abuses should they occur. And in many cases, starting work at the jobs promised to migrants, it's often in fact substantially delayed by kind of the endless series of trainings, medical examinations, skills tests, documents that migrants have to get before they depart to go abroad. Another key issue that's raised in the book is that for regular migration to truly be more beneficial for migrant workers, it really requires that the stakeholders involved are acting in good faith in fulfilling its promises. However, what we see, of course, is very clear. Many government officials, many employers, many recruitment agencies, other intermediaries in these processes, in fact, take advantage of their roles as gatekeepers within migration regimes to advance their own interests. The book applies this concept of rendering technical to describe this depoliticizing of problems of greed and corruption that are frequently involved. What we know, of course, is that indeed documentation costs don't really need to be as high as they are for migrants. And likewise, recruitment agencies, they could charge the fees and costs involved to the employers who are actually benefiting from their services. In addition, governments could crack down on illegal recruitment practices if they weren't, in fact, owned in some cases, and in other cases protected by ranking government officials. And there's certainly no need for these extremely rushed and expensive registration windows in Thailand, other than, as we know, they are extremely profitable for many of the relevant authorities involved. It's clear that, changing these realities, it's not only a technical undertaking, it also requires taking on the vested interests of stakeholders, which I'm afraid to say is something that very few international organizations are willing to try to do. The book suggests there is sort of a complicity that exists between many of the government entities and the international organizations that work with them. And this contributes to what Maryann refers to as the spectacle of safe migration, rather than what is needed, which is more substantive rights and protections. In particular, the book really does provide a devastating assessment of the services provided at the Phoi Phet Center, Transit Center, to assist returning migrants. I think when Maryann observed the migrants at the center, it's quite clearly revealed in the book that many of the services that were meant to help them are in fact very superficial. They're donor driven, and in some cases even restrictive of the rights and agency of migrants in some cases. I'm sure, yeah, it's a tough read, including for myself in some parts, who, of course, we spend a lot of time trying to deliver these services. But I think it's also very, very beneficial to take a hard look in the mirror and reconsider some of what we are doing in trying to support migrants. What comes out very clearly in Maryann's book is that the current approach to migration governance that exists in Thailand, it isn't, in fact, really in the interest of many of the stakeholders involved. In many ways, it's kind of a system of organized rent seeking that requires additional time, money, and bureaucracy without, in fact, achieving the goals that it's supposed to. I think if a tipping point is ever reached one day where, yeah, the costs involved, the unfreedoms involved for migrants actually simply become too burdensome or too expensive for migrants to bear, and they decide to just stay at home, I think the reality is that indeed major sectors of the Thai economy would likely, fall apart entirely because they are very dependent on migrants. Interestingly, I think although, Maryann focuses her book on Cambodian migrants in Thailand, the case for her argument is probably even stronger for Myanmar at this stage since the military coup. At this point, there's really no effort to conceal the way in which the military junta weaponizes regular migration channels to exploit migrant workers. Using regular channels in Myanmar, it now explicitly involves state-based forms of exploitation, including double taxation, mandatory use of extortionate official exchange rates, and the possibility indeed of forced conscription into the military. As Maryann said, although of course it is a very thorough critique of the problems with regular migration to Thailand, it's important to note that the book is really not an argument in favor of irregular migration as a viable alternative. Rather, I see it as kind of a plea for greater recognition that migration just doesn't really need to be governed to the extent that it is now. Until only very recently in the Mekong region, in fact, the borders were always very fluid and people routinely crossed back and forth between countries without incident. What many policymakers seem to have forgotten is that indeed migration is really fundamental to the human experience, can never be fully controlled by nation states. Governments can't simply open a tap to let in more migrant workers when they need them and then drain them out again when they're no longer desirable. that is because, yeah, migrant workers are human beings and they bring with them their full humanity when they go abroad, not just their opposable thumbs. What Maryann's book shows us is that indeed, if we really want safer, fairer, and more dignified migration in Thailand and throughout the region, what we need is not more intensive migration management, but indeed much less of it. That's it for me, and thanks very much.
Much for this well-articulated review. Now I open the floor to any comments or question that you may have on what has been said by the author as well as by Ben, or your own experience. Maybe you want to say something as assistant. I could think you did a lot of the field work, so maybe you can add something. Not at this point. Okay, later on maybe. Okay. Yeah.
Like bring back a memory that I spent with Maryann. We spent together at the Bad Brothers and in Maryann and all of this place. So it's nice feeling.
It was quite nice to have someone at the end of the day to say, "Can you believe that?" After some of the stories that we heard. There's a lot of stories in the book I didn't have time to share tonight, but gosh, we saw things that were quite surprising to me and hard to process sometimes. So it was nice to have someone to process them.
So maybe if there is time, you can share some. So please.
Okay, I'm Rebecca, also from the ILO. So sorry for a bit of ILO dominance. I was thinking at the same time you were doing the research, I was doing research on a different type of state intervention in migration, which was on banning some people from moving. Right? So governing them in a different way, but still this element of heavy governance. And so that was around a fear at that time of women mostly going into domestic work, are going to be abused, are going to face trafficking, don't let them go, right? And people went anyway. And I remember, so just wanting to connect to what you were saying, I remember a conversation I had with domestic workers from Myanmar who were not allowed to have migrated here, but they did. So I said, well, do you want your government to take off this ban? And they said, well, only if what they put in instead is in our interest. So sure, we want to go through MOU, but only if it's in our interest. The way it works now, I don't want anything to do with it. Exactly what you're saying, right? So they said, actually, it works much better for me if I am registered as an employee of a factory or a construction site, because then I can change my job whenever I want, because my domestic worker employer doesn't have that control over whether I change or not, right? And then I was also reflecting as you were talking about how far we've moved in a way from that initial time of putting on the documentation to a place now where it seems like the MOU system is failing, given Myanmar especially. And so now at this point, there's 80% of people are not going through the MOU, but instead are getting registered through the cabinet resolution process. And so everyone in the system here is trying to figure out what that means. And okay, if the MOU is failing, then this whole system we set up doesn't even work. It's too costly. And the terms of the cabinet resolution are different in that they give more freedoms actually to the worker. But there's an effort right now to start limiting them. So the current cabinet resolution process is putting on some of the same MOU restrictions, making it called a MOU-like process. And yeah, just interesting watching these waves of governance as they're going around. I'll stop there. Just no question at the moment.
I'm Jerry Huguet, a former consultant on international migration, now long retired. First of all, thank you for a very impressive presentation. I'm looking forward to reading the book. It doesn't surprise me that for most migrants from Cambodia especially, it's probably easier and cheaper and preferable to come as an irregular migrant rather than going through the legal channels. That's been true for 20 years or more, okay? What did surprise me is that you talked about the extent of microfinance in rural Cambodia. I hadn't been aware of that, and how that is tied into legal migration. So that raises the question for me of the microfinance system. How does that relate to the private recruitment agents? Because one of the big problems in Cambodia, aside from the government restrictions, is really the control and the lack of regulation of the private recruitment agencies. Okay, and how I would expect that they probably are collaborating with the microfinance. Also, second question, you looked at the Poipet Return Center. Did you have a chance to do any field work in Thailand on the Thai side of the border? I know that they've set up new one-stop service centers for the Cambodian migrants coming in. Are they effective? Do they help or not? So.
Yeah, so microfinance story is a really important one in Cambodia. It's important not just for understanding migration and how migration is changing and how the experiences of migrants are changing, but also for understanding a whole set of other things in Cambodia: agrarian change and land dispossession and land consolidation and just livelihoods in general. So I haven't looked at the data recently, but I think that it's still true that the average microfinance loan, and we should probably just say commercial bank loan at this point, because most of those original microfinance institutions have now turned into commercial banks or have majority shareholders that are commercial banks. So, these are Taiwan-based banks, Singaporean-based banks that now kind of are the primary owners or investors in microfinance. So it's probably no longer appropriate to call it microfinance. These loans are tremendously large, especially given Cambodians' typical incomes, and they've been outpacing income growth for quite some time now. So I saw a presentation. I was just at a workshop in Hong Kong on Cambodia, and one of the presenters suggested that the average microfinance loan size in Cambodia was the highest in the world. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. That's not my research, but it wouldn't surprise me, let's just say. And there's since COVID-19, there's been some efforts to restructure some loans and to offer some kind of ways to keep the microfinance industry on track so that they don't have too many bad loans, essentially. But this is starting to kind of, the seams are starting to tear a little, let's just say. So there's some people who are, have for many years have been predicting a kind of broader crisis in the Cambodian economy as a consequence of this kind of reckless lending, and what I would call reckless and predatory lending. So the question is, how do these relate to the recruitment industry? And there's a few answers. I mean, first off, just many people, as I kind of briefly mentioned in the presentation, are outside of recruitment agencies just funding their documentation costs through microfinance loans, right? But then the legal recruitment agencies, what I've learned, and I should say this is This was challenging to learn about because when we tried to contact legal recruitment agencies, we were politely walked out the door. You know, we did not have a lot of great conversations with legal recruitment agencies or their representatives. However, it is clear that in some ways there are partnerships, or if not official partnerships, that recruitment agencies have benefited from the expansion of microfinance, because now instead of saying, okay, you want to go to Cambodia with top, or to Thailand with top manpower, it's going to cost $600 or $900 or whatever it is. In the past, this would typically have been repaid through wage deductions over time, but that puts some risk on the recruitment agency, you know, or the employer. And now it's been much easier. At the time of my research, there were more who were saying, okay, you only have to pay, we're not going to do that anymore, pay out of pocket, but you can get a loan through ACLIDA or through PRESAC, because we know they'll give you one. And so this wasn't necessarily a formal partnership, but it was an opportunity for recruitment companies to shift the risk of those loans to someone else. And in this case, the someone else is the migrant household, because these loans in Cambodia are almost, I mean, certainly loans of that size would be collateralized with land, either hard or soft title. And so again, it really reshapes the risk of migration, because in the past, you want to come home, well, you lose the investment that you've made, but the migrant, or certainly their family, is not the one who bears the that risk stops, right? It stops at the border. And if the loans are collateralized through land, the risk of those loans doesn't stop at the border. The second question. So I did visit the national verification centers, several of the national verification centers in Lat Phrao and Rayong, and there was a new one as well. And are they effective? Oh gosh, you might just have to read the book. Let's just say that I think that there's a line where I say in the book, and let's see if this is right, Passy, with your memory too, but I don't think I met anyone who received documents the same, all the documents they needed the same day. Certainly not for the cost that it was promised at. But I did hear some kind of wild stories, you know, because and this is because of the what Ben mentioned. There was a queue system in place for national verification at the centers. And so that means they could only offer so many places each day. But inevitably, there were always more people who showed up with, you know, seemingly valid letters than there were spots for the day. And so then what would happen to those people became quite complicated and problematic. And because of the kind of strictness of the agreement of how many people could be processed for documents each day, there were always people who ended up in limbo, you know, for 3 days, for 5 days, told to come back later, you know, had to pay more costs. The broker charged another, you know, however many thousands of baht. And so, are, you know, they were effective in some way, certainly. But one of the things the book documents is that there were a lot of people who were shut out of the national verification system, but still wanted documents. Their employers were demanding documents. And so what happened is they started doing what was described in, to me, and what I describe in the book as recycling. So the legal recruitment companies would essentially work with the legal recruitment companies in Cambodia would work with a Thai construction, you know, employer and say, oh, you need 100 people to get documents, and you can't use the national verification process. It's taking too long, or the queue's closed, or whatever. Well, we'll do it for you. Send them through the Migrant Assistance Center in Phoi Phet. Bring them to Sakao at the immigration center, and they'll get put on the bus, and they'll get deported, and they'll get the safe migration education where they learn that the only way to go to Thailand is to go through legal, safe channels. And then they will go to Phnom Penh, and they'll get passports, and then they'll get smuggled back across the border by the legal recruitment company. And then they will there keep working for their employer without documents until their passports are ready with their visas and their work permit through the legal recruitment company. And then they'll go back through the Migrant Assistance Center again. They'll get deported the second time, right? So they're counting in official deportation statistics twice. They're not being deported, right? And then they will get their passports, and then they'll cross the border again legally. And so we observed this, you know, many times at Phoi Phet, where the kind of safe migration center at Phoi Phet is actually operating as a site of brokerage by the legal recruitment companies, trying to get people documents because the Thai system isn't working well. And of course, these are much more expensive, not to mention the fact that you have the legal recruitment company smuggling you back across the border, right? So there's just, you know, tremendous absurdities in what was produced.
But I am waiting.
Thanks, Maryann. That was a really interesting talk. I'm Brian Elau, and I work for Human Rights Watch. So we have some research coming out on both microfinance debt in Cambodia, as well as the situation of Myanmar nationals in Thailand since the coup. So lots of food for thought. I'm curious to know sort of whether this sort of like more critical take on migrants' experiences of like the safe migration pathway, whether scholars working in other parts of the world have sort of seen similar patterns and sort of have advanced similar critiques, or if some of this is like unique to just how ad hoc and patchwork the Thai system is and all those opportunities that exist for these sort of patterns of brokerage. So I'd be curious to also kind of just hear a bit about how this fits into the broader, academic work on the topic.
Thank you. That's a great question, and I'm glad you're here. And so there are a growing number of critiques of regularization as not being fully protective, certainly, and also a growing number of people recognizing that when migrants engage with the state, then the state tends to have more control over their movements and can put more restrictions in place. So both of those are being documented in other places. But there is a lot of this that seems to me to be more Thailand specific, or at least specific to a set of circumstances. And I don't know enough about the world to know where else these circumstances exist. But, you know, one piece of this is that the Cambodian state has very little appetite to do any kind of control of legal recruitment companies. So there's, you know, they just kind of get away with doing what they do. So that's one piece of it. The other piece is that in the research that I did, it did not seem to me that the labor protections that Thailand has on paper work tremendously well in practice. And I should be careful saying that because I don't know Thailand as well as many people in this room, but that kind of was borne out in my data. And so that's another piece of it. But the other piece of it is that, you know, this is a porous border with large Cambodian population. There have been, you know, hundreds of thousands of, if not more, Cambodians in Thailand for many, many years. They have strong networks. So this is a very strong and dynamic migration system. And because of that, I think it's easy for Cambodians, even when they don't have documents, to be actually relatively protected and safe in certain kinds of ways. And so far, there have not been widespread crackdowns that have, you know, threatened that ability. And I think it would be hard to imagine a context. In fact, in 2014, of course, we saw the Thai state tried to crack down on migration, and Cambodians left, and they invited them back very, very quickly, right? So the degree to which the economy is dependent on migrant labor and the inability of the Thai state to forcibly crack down on migration creates a context in which not having legal status doesn't always produce the outcomes that it does, say, in my country, in the United States, right? Or in many other parts of the world. So there's many things that are unique about the Thai case. There are these kind of quasi-legal forms of protection. You know, it's an ad hoc system. Often migrants can have some form of security by paying off police. You know, they have strong support networks. There's replenishment that's happening across the border. The border's not particularly well controlled. You know, it's long. So there's just a number of things that are evident here that I think create a circumstance in which it's not just that legal status isn't protective, it's that irregular status isn't particularly risky in certain kinds of ways. And, you know, people that I spoke with would say the only hard part about not having documents or a full set of documents in Thailand is the journey. The journey is risky and uncomfortable and, you know, hard. But if we get caught, we can cross the border again. We can find work again. Our employers will find us and hire us or offer us jobs. So I think there's many things. I do think some of these things are present in other contexts. So I don't think it's a uniquely Thai case, but I do think that there's some limits on the argument and what's happening.
Thank you. I haven't read the book yet, so I'm going to ask a question and you can let me know. But I'm curious at all if you look at the historical elements of immigration to Thailand. I mean, a couple of things that struck me historically about immigration to Thailand in general is that at least there was a time during colonialism when if you were a protege or a European citizen, you would have complete impunity under the extraterritoriality laws. So essentially, you were a human person inside of Thailand who wasn't underneath the Thai governance system. And then I think that the next update to that law is in 1975, when the current main immigration law came out. And of course, I don't know what was happening at the debates about migration at the time, but at least 1975 was a time when there were refugees being produced from Cambodia, and it was still the Ne Win years in Burma under the socialist program. So I'm wondering if there is anything, a lasting legacy about the laws that are on the books that essentially create a migration system beyond rights, in the sense that the system, the laws in the books were never trying to create immigrant rights for people.
I think that's a book that should be written. So no, I don't really engage with that type of history in the book, but I do think it's a reasonable question, and I think it would be great if someone wanted to explore it. The way that I frame the kind of lack of rights that Cambodians have in the book is really pushing to think of Thailand as having more of a guest, or seeking to have more of a guest worker program type of a form of migration management, which of course doesn't make a lot of sense given the context of these migrations and their longstanding history and the degree to which Thailand is dependent on migrant labor. So the answer is no, but I think it's a wonderful topic for research.
Any other?
Work by Olivier Aubrac, who look at the Olivier Aubrac, he look at the colonial histories of the migration of the Khmer people from northern Laos to Thailand to northern Chiang Mai. It's very interesting the way, I think, how the Thai create the law to restrict the migration movement from a historical view.
Okay, any other? No, then I go with my question. It happens that I just finished a small research on recruitment in the construction sector in Thailand, which is small scale. So all the limitation of small scale, unfortunately, not an ethnographic study like this, but there are some interesting issues which I would like you to reflect on. So interestingly, of the 30 more migrants interviewed, no one passed the border officially. They all pass with the help of friends, relatives, and therefore, especially from Cambodia, they pass without any help from brokers and anyone. The Myanmar, interestingly, there is a shift to provinces that are more far from the border, the conflict areas, so Bago and other areas. So you see they need to use a broker for the travel within Myanmar up to the border end. But in terms of information on the work itself is all provided by friends. So that cut into the recruiter's role. And of course, it means very lower cost, not for the Myanmar that have to travel from very far, but from the Cambodian one is like free, so to say. But then the problems start in Thailand. At some point, if they stay 10 years, 15 years, they have to find a way to regularize. And that is where you have to go through multiple times of cabinet resolution or back to Cambodia and then back. And this is the question I asked actually Ben yesterday. How many times can you do this memorandum of understanding process? Because it seems it's unending, you know, do 2 years, 4 years, which is the limit, but then they go again for the year, and then they go again another 4 years, and then it seems they can continue somehow to do it. So I don't know if you have any experience on this, because, or data on this, because that would be of interest to me. Now, the other issue, the construction sector is much higher memorandum of understanding compared to, much higher cabinet resolution compared to memorandums understanding compared to other sectors. And that is related also to the kind of job, because project construction are very short, and then they don't want to employ people necessarily, and they want to do it in country rather than, so they hire in country, and they also, so a lot of hiring these days is in country more than. Now, I don't know if you have any information about difference across different sectors, whether some sector use more of the regular way than other sector, and what kind of regulation they use. I stop here, but I have more in case there is no one also asking. Yes.
I bet Ben could respond to some of those in some ways better than I could, but what I will say is that it's rare for me in Cambodia, certainly. Like when I was doing my early research, it was rare for me to meet someone who had gone through the MOU process. When I came to Thailand, I met more people who had gone through the MOU process, but I don't know that I met anybody who had been able to extend the MOU process, you know, more than twice. However, what was interesting to me is many people had more than one passport. And it did not seem altogether clear to me that the Cambodian government was, or the Thai government was actually tracking the fact that these were new passports and somehow, you know, linking the two. I think we met somebody who had 3 passports at least. And, you know, they would just use these for different purposes. So, yeah, it did not seem to me that it seemed to me that one of the things that helped migrants was that systems of data and documentation were not particularly well functioning. And I worried, as I saw all of this new biometric data being collected, that as these systems got better and better at tracking and tracing people, that actually many of the creative ways that they did manage to stay for 10 or 15 years were going to be unavailable to them. Just as another example, we were told that people who were deported were actually blacklisted and kind of unable to migrate through legal channels in the future, but that did not seem to actually be true in practice. So again, it's not clear to me what was going on there, whether that was a willful, you know, that they were able to do that because someone turned an eye or because they didn't know. And I'm not sure how good the biometric data collection, you know, links to passports and all of that are right now, either on the Thai or the Cambodian side. But as they get better, I think it's going to close off some of those options for creativity that might be how people have managed to do this in the past. Now I forgot your other question. Oh, the difference between sectors. You know, I don't have any information about that from the ethnographic fieldwork, but I did work on an IOM report that looked at some of the IOM and ILO data that did suggest quite different levels of the use, or that some sectors were particularly, in some sectors, there were more people who had migrated through regular channels. And in fact, one of the things that I remember noticing about that was that the construction sector had more people who had migrated through regular channels. I think that that's right. And I was looking at that because I was curious. At some point, I looked at the data. This is quantitative data. It's a relatively large survey. And it showed that people who had gone through regular channels made a little bit more than those who went through irregular channels. And I was like, oh, well, okay, that's good. But if you looked at it at a sector by sector basis, you know, if you just look at the folks who have gone through regular channels in the, that are working in the construction sector who have gone through regular channels versus irregular channels, the difference is not present. So it's really a function of the fact that certain sectors, higher paying jobs often are associated with more regular migration. So that's one thing that I do recall.
Yeah, I can add a little bit on that. I mean, I think you talk about the systems that are used to actually manage the data for the MOU and other legal processes in Thailand for many years. They've been extremely flawed. At one point, in fact, IOM, I think, was running it for them at the ministry, but there's really never been a very comprehensive effort made to sort of avoid duplications or flaws within the data. I mean, there was never really an ability to track how many times migrants were entering the system because, yeah, I mean, there wasn't sort of, oh, this person's already been in the system, they can't enter again. But they were just entered again and again and again. And I mean, to my knowledge, hasn't entirely been corrected. I know, as Maryann said, there are efforts to now sort of enhance the way that the data is managed. There is use of biometric data. There is scanning of retinas now involved as well. But I think in many cases, it's not really done in a way where you can track an individual migrant's engagement in those processes over time. And as I was saying to you the other day, a lot of this policy is just made up on an ad hoc basis. So yeah, there's an MOU, but it doesn't really cover all of the steps, all of the policies involved with the MOU. That's sort of made up as it goes along. So if indeed there are more migrants needed in Thailand at that particular time, then it's fine for migrants to use the MOU again. I mean, there's no hard and fast rules about exactly sort of what the limit is in terms of its use. So yeah, I mean, I think that's the data quality isn't at a level, data management quality isn't at a level where you could actually comprehensively limit migrants' use of the MOU channel or even other channels. In terms of the sectoral issue, yeah, I mean, in general, what you see with the MOU is it's particularly very formalized sectors of the economy. So particularly export-oriented manufacturing, construction, etc., because those companies often do have pressures on them in terms of their reputation for their business practices. They have to show that they're trying to go through the legal process and do things properly. For the sector I work in the most, which is fishing, those kinds of pressures don't exist. So, in fact, almost no migrants enter the fishing sector through the MOU process. It's very, very limited. So yeah, I mean, in terms of patterns of use of the legal channels, it's really the companies that are under scrutiny from buyers, from external sources that are trying to make an effort to sort of go through the legal processes. Yeah.
Jerry, and then yes.
Just a very small aside on the data systems. Once on an IOM project, I was interviewing a Ministry of Labor official in Naypyidaw regarding the nationality verification system, and that involves something like 24 steps of going back and forth. But one of them is the identification of the worker in Thailand goes to this office in Myanmar, and they have to verify that, yes, this is a Myanmar national. Okay. So I asked him how many people they had rejected or how many people they had identified who are not Myanmar nationals. None. It was purely a system. They stamp it and they take the fee. So it was purely a money-making procedure. Had nothing to do with collecting statistics or verification.
And then
The question for Ben. just curious, even after you said the fishing's, the working condition in the fishing hasn't really got any better, even after they got the yellow card from the EU some years ago. It doesn't change so much, or I don't know.
I wanted to ask Maryann about in the same way Leah was asking about different sectors, to ask about different genders and whether women were taking more debt, less debt, different kinds of debt, and similarly making different decisions about getting documentation. And the other thing I wanted to reflect on is that people with medium skills, high skills, lots of people in this room didn't pay anyone to move here. And so the more wealthy you are, the less you pay, you keep your wealth. But the poorer you are, the more you have to pay out. And I just find that society has created these systems that just continue to expand inequality.
And first, and then Maryann.
Sure. Well, it's a big question. In fact, yes, my project will be releasing a large-scale survey covering this issue of working conditions quite soon. So I don't want to spoil it too much, but I will say, yes, I mean, if the story has been that indeed the job is done in terms of fixing the abuses against migrants in the fishing sector in Thailand, that's not what the research shows. I mean, I think what we see is that indeed the laws and policies, the regulation is much improved from the way it used to be, which was basically the Wild West. I mean, anything used to be allowable. People were at sea for years, disappeared in Indonesia, were thrown overboard. The most egregious kinds of abuses committed against migrants are less common than they used to. But I mean, the research that we have conducted shows there are still quite severe problems with working conditions in the sector. A lot of migrants in particular face wage-related abuses because in the end, yeah, it comes down to the financial bottom line for employers. How much they have to pay to their migrant employees is the biggest concern for them. So there still are a lot of problems with migrants facing issues of wage theft in the industry in particular. But we also see extreme cases of forced labor happening still too. So yeah, I won't go into too much more detail, but indeed, there's a reason that we continue to work on these issues in Thailand. Structures are in place to better regulate the industry, but in practice, a lot of migrants still face very poor working conditions.
I really appreciate the question, and I'm going to give an imperfect and partial answer, but I'm going to answer with a story, which is that Pasi and I spent some time in Rayong, where the kind of labor that migrants do is quite gendered. And so many of the men were working on boats, and they were, away for a week or longer periods of time. And they, many of them were married, and they had wives who worked in the port. And I don't think that we met anyone who had any woman who was in that area that had a formal job. So they were all working informally. They were working, they would be called to the ports when the boats would come in, and they would sort fish, and they would be paid a certain amount of money for it. And they would do other piecemeal labor for the port owners and the boat owners. And so there's an interesting question there, which is, well, how do those women navigate documentation? Because actually, technically, no matter what, they're not actually working legally, because in Thailand, it's not possible to do that type of work and to have a valid work permit for that type of labor. But in the wake of the 2017 ordinance and the concern of crackdowns, they wanted to get documents, and so the men were able to get documents through their employers. And that was quite straightforward, and their wages would be deducted, and it was costly, but that's what that was. But the boat owners were not willing to sponsor women and to deduct the wives' documentation costs from their husband's wages, because that was risky for a variety of reasons. Also, they didn't want to sponsor those women as their workers. So the women had a few choices, right? You could remain undocumented or just have a pink card, or you could work through, if you were lucky, maybe the boat owner of your husband's boat owner would sponsor you, but you would probably have to pay the costs up front. So you have to find a way to get that money. Or you have to go through a subcontractor where it's even more costly and you have to pay the costs upfront. And so what we saw was more of those women taking loans from the microfinance institutions in Cambodia, whether they had to go home to do that or they could sort it out in some other way. And so those were the more risky situations for families. Now, of course, that's actually risky for the whole family, not just for the women. But that was a particular gendered situation that we encountered that really was about the way that in that particular context, informality and informal work was something that women did more of. And so the risks were kind of a gender and informal labor type of risk. So I think that there's actually quite a lot of room to figure out, I think there's a lot we don't know about the way that both debt and also documentation costs and the challenges of the intersection of those things are gendered. But that's one piece that I can say, that the degree to which women are working more in informal work. Because also the other piece of that is then even when they have documents, they're not valid, or at least they could be seen as invalid. So you spend all that money, you get a loan with your land title, as collateral for this document that ultimately actually is giving you the right to do work that the Thai government says you're not allowed to do.
Okay, any last question? Oh.
Follow up. I mean, one thing that strikes me about formality in Thailand is, I mean, at least in ASEAN, I think Thailand has the highest rates of informality in the economy. I mean, Thai people can't even work in a formal job, even if they want to, a lot of them. And I think that some of this is maybe a result of maybe just the way of the bureaucracy works. I don't have a question. That's just a thought.
I'll just say one more thing about that, which is that later, not for the book research, but later when I was working with the IOM, I actually went to the Myanmar border. And one of the things that I learned when I was there was that there were many people who had actually been deported because they had the wrong work visa, or wrong visa and work permit. They were doing a job that they weren't supposed to be doing, right? Whether that was informal work or just something that was different than what was on their work permit, and they didn't even know it, right? And there's a challenge here because the employers control that process, and the migrant might not even know that they don't have the legal right to do the work that they're doing, and they've invested all of this money in making that document, and then ultimately, they get deported. And that was something that I learned was happening there. And so there's, again, this is about migration management. It's a particular problem for those who are working informally, but the same thing can happen when someone is simply working in a job that's different from the job that's on their work permit.
Well, just to comment on this last, I think because there are so many documents that you need to have, right? The passport and the pink card, and now also the pink card and the work permit, etc. Many workers, at least from this research, think if you have the passport or a pink card, that is enough already. And so the question of they pay for what is a very good question, because they may think it's to regularize, they just get the passport, it's already, they are happy about that. So there is this misunderstanding that identity and the pink card particularly, which is a residence government, doesn't necessarily mean you can work, right, as work permit, although in principle you should get the pink card after you get the work permit. I mean, it's all complicated. So partial documentation, I think, is a big issue which needs to be investigated much more than has been the case so far. And the second, on the wage delays and wage abiding or not paying of wage, that is extremely common. I mean, all the informant protested, and their way of solution is to move to another subcontractor eventually, because to go and complain is not an option in most of the case. So I think this is again another issue which is much wider than we think. I think it's very, very, of course, in the case of construction, they say it's related to the nature of the construction sector, but where the subcontractor is not paid but we're talking about other sectors, so it's probably much wider. But there are many other, yes, Ben, you want to say something? Oh, okay. So I think this is just to conclude then. I think there are many more questions than, because the question is also why they still migrate if it is not worth financially. I mean, that is, I think, I don't know if you have a question to that or.
I do have an answer to that, I think, and I would say because they need to. And I think what's happening in Cambodia and the expansion of debt in Cambodia is a significant part of why many people tolerate some of these changes. I don't have data on that, but that's my take.
Follow up in research, yeah.
Some people do, but that's also very challenging. It's much more challenging.
Yes, Ben.
I just wanted to make a concluding point on it from me. It just, yeah, I mean, I think a key piece of when you talk about legal status in Thailand, it's not unintentional that there is this level of precarity for migrant workers. I mean, it is, what's been created is sort of a market where you can purchase different levels of ability to remain and live your life relatively free of the possibility of being deported. That's yeah, I mean, that's done intentionally so that it's a money-making scheme to leverage the need of migrant workers to come to Thailand to find work. There is this concept within the academic world of deportability, and that, you know, that's been since the beginning of more formalized migration policies in Thailand. That's always been a key element. In fact, from the start, when people registered in Thailand for variously what was called pink cards or registration, it was not that they were legal in Thailand. They had just been given a reprieve from being deported. That was officially the status that was given to them. And I think that has not really changed to any great extent today. I mean, you're allowed to stay, but you're never really on solid footing in Thailand. You're all, as a migrant, you're always worried about how long you're going to be able to stay and when you're going to have to leave and when you're going to have to renew your documents. That's all a very intentional policy in Thailand. Thanks.
I think this is, you want to have some concluding?
No, I just it was such a wonderful conversation, and I hope the conversation continues. And I think what a book aims to do is start a conversation. And so I just thank you for engaging with the ideas.
Thank you. And we look forward to your next research and book. And of course, we at SEA-Junction look forward to continue this important conversation on migration and other related topic. As usual, on your way out, just give donation to support the activity of SEA-Junction. We have only one book left, so move quick because well, the other one are already gone, and there is some coffee and tea for you to continue this conversation more informally. Thank you very much. And the next event is going to be on health, right?
Okay, thank you for sticking throughout the event today. Our upcoming event will be also on a book launch on public health and food by a team of researchers from Singapore, Indonesia, and Myanmar. So please join us again here at SEA-Junction for our upcoming events in June.
21. Yeah, June 21. Oh, sorry, June 6. We have so many that I am getting confused. Is the title of the book is Why People Get Sick and Some People More Than Others. It's about health equity. So will be very health equity in Southeast Asia. We will have also another event on the 21, which is more a book on LGBT. It's a graphic design book by a Thai designer, and the book has no language, so anyone can read for children. So that is somewhat different, but important. Okay, thank you very much. And again, enjoy the coffee, enjoy the food, and buy the book if you still want. The last one wait for you. Thank you very much.